It began as a simple experiment, just one day without my phone. No notifications, no scrolling, no checking the time or taking photos. I told myself it would be easy. After all, it's only 24 hours. But as soon as I turned it off, the silence hit me. It wasn't peaceful, it was unnerving. The world suddenly felt heavier, slower, and louder all at once. At first, I didn't know what to do with my hands. I reached for my pocket every few minutes, the phantom vibration buzzing in my mind. My body moved before I could stop it, muscle memory, trained through years of habit. That's when I realized it. I wasn't just turning off a device. I was unplugging from something that had rewired me completely. Time began to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. I kept glancing at the clock on the wall, wondering how I usually filled the empty spaces between tasks. Normally, I'd scroll, tap, swipe, little bursts of color and sound that kept my brain fed. But now, every pause was raw and unfiltered. The silence around me wasn't just quiet, it was uncomfortable. By mid-morning, I started noticing things that had always been there, but somehow invisible when I lived behind the screen. The sound of a distant car engine, the rustle of trees, the rhythm of my own breathing, small, ordinary details that suddenly felt amplified. I caught myself watching sunlight slide across the wall, changing its color by the minute. It felt strange to be fully aware of something so simple. But awareness also brought discomfort. I realized how addicted I was to distraction, to having a constant feed of stimulation within reach. Without it, my mind started to wander, to question, to dig. Thoughts I'd pushed aside for weeks began to rise to the surface. It wasn't just boredom I was feeling, it was confrontation. My brain, so used to being occupied, was now face to face with itself. In the afternoon, I tried to read a book. It felt almost impossible at first. My eyes wanted to flick away, to check something that wasn't there. But slowly, as minutes passed, I found myself sinking into the words. My mind began to stretch again, not in the frantic, scrolling way, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of focus. I had forgotten what that felt like. By evening, something began to shift. The world felt calmer, as if it had adjusted its pace to match mine. I walked outside and realized how much time I'd spent capturing life instead of living it. I used to see sunsets through my camera lens, waiting for the perfect shot. This time, I just watched. The sky changed color, the air cooled, and for the first time in months, I didn't think about posting it. I just let it happen. But it wasn't peace yet. It was something heavier, the weight of awareness settling in. My phone wasn't just a device, it was an extension of my identity. It held my photos, my work, my friends, my memories, all the proof that I existed in the digital world. And without it, I felt invisible. It was unsettling to realize how much of who I am depends on something I can hold in my hand. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. The silence in the room was deep, almost uncomfortable. No glow of the screen, no hum of notifications, no endless scroll before sleep. Just stillness. My mind didn't know what to do with it. But beneath that restlessness, a faint clarity began to grow. The first flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Presence. I thought I'd miss connection. But what I missed most wasn't other people. It was distraction itself. And that realization, though quiet, was more powerful than any notification I'd ever received. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, or rather, before the alarm that wasn't there. The first thing I did was reach for my phone, instinctively, only to grasp empty air. My fingers hovered above the table, waiting for the familiar glow that never came. For a moment, I felt completely lost in time. I didn't know what hour it was, who might have messaged me, or what had happened overnight. It's strange how dependent I had become on a small rectangle of light to tell me that the world was still turning. As I sat up, a thought struck me. I used to begin every morning by inviting chaos into my mind. Notifications, headlines, messages, updates, all before I'd even taken a deep breath. It wasn't just information overload, it was emotional overload. Every morning, my brain sprinted before my body even stood. But today it was silent. Too silent. My mind, deprived of its usual flood, started making its own noise. Thoughts came rushing in, random, anxious, loud. Did I forget to reply to that email? What if someone needed me? What if something happened and I didn't know? It was like my brain was trying to recreate the constant buzz of my phone from memory. The anxiety wasn't external anymore. It was internalized, alive inside me. I made coffee and sat by the window. The city was waking up, people hurrying with their screens glowing like tiny lighthouses in the fog of the morning. For once, I was outside that flow, observing it instead of being consumed by it. But that distance also came with loneliness. There's a strange comfort in being plugged into the collective hum of everyone else. Without it, I felt disconnected, not from technology, but from the rhythm of society itself. The noise in my head kept building. I found myself talking to myself, humming, tapping the table. My mind was desperate for stimulation. I realized that in the past, every quiet moment had been filled with scrolling, every pause, every second of waiting. I had trained my brain to expect reward after every small delay. The endless feed of social media wasn't just entertainment. It was dopamine, the chemical that makes you feel rewarded, excited, alive. Without it, my brain was going through withdrawal. I remembered reading that the average person checks their phone more than 100 times a day. That's once every 10 minutes, sometimes more. Each time, the brain gets a tiny jolt of satisfaction, like a message, a new piece of content. It's unpredictable, and that's what makes it addictive. Our brains are wired to crave uncertainty because it used to help us survive. But now, instead of searching for food or safety, we're searching for notifications. By noon, I started noticing something else. My attention, once scattered, began to stretch again. I could focus on the way the steam curled from my coffee, on the pattern of light across the floor. But at the same time, I was restless. My thoughts jumped from one thing to another like they were trying to find a feed to scroll through. It was uncomfortable, but fascinating. I could feel my mind detoxing, resisting stillness like it was something unnatural. I decided to write in a notebook, something I hadn't done in years. My handwriting felt clumsy at first, but soon words began to spill out. Not carefully curated, not edited or typed. Just raw, unfiltered thoughts. Writing by hand felt physical, grounding, almost ancient. It was like talking to myself, but slower. And in that slowness, I began to hear things I usually ignored, the patterns of my own thinking, the voice beneath the noise. As the afternoon sun shifted, the world outside my window looked different. I couldn't tell if the light had changed or if I had. The chaos in my head was still there, but it was beginning to soften. My thoughts no longer screamed for attention. They started to whisper. Beneath all that mental clutter, I began to sense a quiet rhythm emerging, the natural hum of my mind without interruption. By evening, I realized that the noise I used to escape with my phone was the same noise I was now confronting. It wasn't the device creating it. It was me. The phone had just been the mirror, reflecting my constant need to escape boredom, silence, and discomfort. Without it, I had nowhere to hide. But maybe that was the point. That night, for the first time in years, I listened, not to music or messages, but to the sound of my own mind settling down. It wasn't peaceful yet, but it was real. I was beginning to remember what it felt like to simply exist, unfiltered, uncurated, unplugged. By the third day, something unusual began to happen, or rather, something ancient began to return. Time, the invisible current that usually rushes past unnoticed, began to slow. Without the constant tapping, swiping, and refreshing, each hour felt longer, wider, more elastic. I had always complained about never having enough time, but now that I wasn't spending it glued to a screen, I realized I had far more of it than I ever imagined. The strange part was that I didn't know how to fill it. In the digital world, time doesn't flow, it loops. You scroll endlessly, losing yourself in an infinite cascade of moments that don't belong to you. Minutes vanish like vapor, stolen by algorithms designed to keep you watching. But in the physical world, time moves differently. It breathes. It expands and contracts depending on how deeply you experience it. I had forgotten that. The morning stretched endlessly. I made breakfast and noticed the rhythm of simple actions. The sizzle of the pan, the smell of toasting bread, the slow rise of steam from my tea. It was mundane, but it was vivid. I began to wonder how many mornings I had missed because I was busy watching other people's lives unfold through a glass screen instead of living my own. For years, I had measured time not by sunrises and sunsets, but by battery percentages and notification counts. Now, time had texture again. But slowing down wasn't all peace and clarity. There was also discomfort, a sense of exposure. When time expands, it forces you to confront yourself. There's no constant refresh button to skip past awkward silences or unwanted emotions. I found myself face to face with things I'd avoided for months. Unfinished goals, unprocessed feelings, unspoken words. Without the blur of digital noise, they surfaced like forgotten ghosts. At one point, I caught myself pacing. My mind wanted something to do, something fast, something stimulating. I thought about all the tiny micro-moments that used to fill my days. Checking messages while waiting in line, scrolling between tasks, refreshing the feed just to avoid being still. I had been living in fragments, tiny slices of borrowed time stitched together by distraction. Now, all those fragments had dissolved, and I was left with the full, unbroken weight of the present. In that strange slowness, I started to rediscover small pleasures I'd overlooked for years. I spent almost an hour watering my plants, noticing how each leaf reached toward the light. I watched clouds drift across the sky, realizing how no two shapes were ever the same. I took a walk without music or podcasts, just the rhythm of footsteps and the wind brushing against the trees. It felt raw, but also grounding, like my senses were slowly recalibrating to the real pace of life. Somewhere in the middle of the day, I began to think about how our phones compress time. A 5-minute scroll feels like nothing, but those fragments add up. Hours, days, weeks of living half present. It's not that the phone steals time from us. It steals our awareness of it. When you're constantly switching between apps and notifications, your brain never fully arrives anywhere. You exist everywhere and nowhere at once. By afternoon, the house felt quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before. The ticking of the wall clock was almost too loud. But instead of reaching for distraction, I let myself listen. Each tick marked the steady march of time, something I had always fought against, always tried to fill. Now, for the first time, I simply let it pass. That evening, I cooked dinner slowly, without rushing, without background noise. The act of preparing food, chopping, stirring, waiting, became almost meditative. My mind stopped racing for the next thing and began to rest in the current moment. I realized that when we slow down, time doesn't just stretch, it deepens. It becomes fuller, more meaningful, less disposable. As night fell, I thought about how technology had rewired my sense of duration. Every ping, every scroll, every endless feed had trained me to expect instant gratification. Instant answers, instant entertainment, instant emotion. Without it, everything felt slower. But in that slowness, I found a strange kind of freedom. Time was no longer something I was losing. It was something I was living inside of. I went to bed without checking the time. The world outside was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive. For once, I didn't measure the day by productivity, messages, or posts. I measured it by presence, by how deeply I had lived each moment. And as I drifted into sleep, I realized something simple yet profound. When we stop trying to control time, we finally begin to feel it. By the 4th day, I realized that the world around me hadn't gone silent. I had. Without my phone, I was no longer half present in every conversation, no longer glancing down every few seconds to check if something more interesting was happening somewhere else. I began noticing how people spoke, how their faces moved, how pauses carried meaning. It was as if every interaction had more weight, more texture, more life. Yet at the same time, it also felt unfamiliar, almost awkward, like learning to speak a language I had once known but forgotten. I met a friend for coffee. Normally, I'd place my phone on the table, face down, pretending that meant I wasn't distracted. But this time, there was nothing between us. Just 2 cups, the hum of a cafe, and conversation. At first, it felt strange. I didn't have the safety net of glancing down at a notification when silence crept in. I had to face those quiet moments head-on, moments I'd usually escape by scrolling. But something interesting happened. In the silence, our conversation deepened. We didn't rush to fill the gaps. We just existed in them. It was uncomfortable at first, then unexpectedly peaceful. As we talked, I noticed how easily we interrupt each other when distracted by devices. A screen buzzes, attention flickers, and a thought disappears. But that day, there was nowhere else to look, nowhere else to run. I listened fully, not waiting to respond, not half-engaged, but really listening. I saw how emotions shifted across expressions, how laughter emerged slowly instead of instantly. It was like watching real-time unfold in its natural rhythm again, not edited into highlights or shortened into stories. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't performing my life. I was living it. Later, I walked through the park and watched families, couples, and friends sitting together, each of them partly somewhere else. Their bodies were here, but their minds were scattered across countless digital spaces. Some laughed at something on a screen rather than something right in front of them. Others sat quietly, scrolling side by side, together but alone. I wondered if that was what I used to look like, surrounded by people yet absent from the moment. It hit me then how technology hasn't made us less social. It's made us social in ways that cost us depth. We connect more, but understand less. Without my phone, conversations felt slower, but more honest. I found myself asking questions I didn't usually ask, giving answers that weren't filtered or rehearsed. Words came out imperfectly, sometimes messy, sometimes raw, but they were mine. There was no emoji to hide behind, no perfectly crafted response typed and edited in silence. It was human communication in its purest form, unpredictable, emotional, alive. I remembered something I had once read, that our brains synchronize during real conversation. When we talk face to face, our neural rhythms align. We literally start to mirror each other's emotions, tone, and energy. But when we text, that biological synchrony fades. We trade empathy for efficiency. The more we rely on screens to communicate, the more detached we become from the very signals that make connection real. Eye contact, tone of voice, the pause before a smile. Losing that, even briefly, reshapes how we understand one another. As the day faded, I had dinner with my family. It struck me how often we used to eat with phones beside our plates, heads bowed not in gratitude, but in attention to something elsewhere. This time, the meal felt different. The conversation lingered. Laughter echoed longer. We argued a little, teased each other, told stories. Not because it was special, but because it was real. I realized that in chasing global connection through screens, I had neglected the smaller, quieter connections right beside me. That night, as I sat in bed, I thought about how the human voice used to be the center of the world. How people told stories, sang songs, shared fears and dreams around firelight long before electricity existed. And now we whisper into microphones, send snippets, share fragments. But we rarely feel one another. Turning off my phone had not isolated me. It had reintroduced me to something sacred, the unedited, unfiltered energy of human presence. I lay in the dark and listened, not for a ping or vibration, but for the soft sounds of life happening around me. The distant hum of traffic, a dog barking, someone laughing on a street corner. Signs of a world that exists without a screen to validate it. It felt ancient, simple, and grounding. For the first time in years, I wasn't just connected. I was in connection, not through signals or data, but through silence, attention, and the art of being fully there. By the fifth day, something inside me began to shift. The initial restlessness had faded, replaced by a quiet that felt deeper than silence. Without constant notifications to break my focus, my thoughts started to stretch out like uncoiling thread. It was as though I had finally made room for my own mind to breathe. But what filled that space at first wasn't peace. It was emptiness. The kind of emptiness that feels like standing in a vast, echoing room where every sound is your own. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. For so long, my attention had been borrowed, directed, fragmented, consumed. My phone had always provided an easy escape from myself. Now there was nowhere to hide. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching sunlight fall through the window, realizing that this was the first time in years I'd had no external agenda. No content to absorb, no feed to scroll, no alerts to answer. Just me and my thoughts, unfiltered, unpredictable, sometimes uncomfortable. The mind is a restless creature. When you take away its usual toys, it doesn't settle quietly, it rebels. Ideas, memories, and emotions long buried began to surface like dust rising in sunlight. I remembered conversations I'd forgotten, plans I'd abandoned, even small regrets I hadn't realized I was carrying. It was messy, but also strangely cleansing. It felt like I was decluttering not my room, but my consciousness. Then, slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The emptiness started to transform. From that quiet space, new thoughts began to take shape, ideas I hadn't had time to think before. I began to daydream, not as a distraction, but as an act of creation. My imagination, long dulled by constant digital noise, started to wake up again. I noticed patterns in things, the way light shifted through leaves, the rhythm of footsteps on the pavement, the small poetry of ordinary life. It was as though my mind had been waiting patiently for me to return. I picked up a pencil and started sketching. Nothing serious, just lines and shapes. I had almost forgotten how much joy there was in creating something that didn't need to be shared. There was no pressure for it to be perfect, no urge to post it for approval. It was just mine. For so long, I had equated creativity with productivity, content, results, engagement. But true creativity is slower. It grows out of stillness, not stimulation. and I realized how much that stillness had been missing from my life. In those hours of mental quiet, my thoughts became more layered, more alive. I started noticing connections between things, ideas linking together in ways they hadn't before. Without my phone constantly interrupting, my brain could actually finish a thought. That's when it hit me. I hadn't lost focus, I'd been robbed of it. Every notification, every scroll, every flicker of a screen had trained my brain to think in fragments. Now, for the first time, my mind was whole again. There's a kind of loneliness in silence, but it's a sacred one. It's the loneliness that artists, writers, and thinkers used to know, the space where the inner world becomes louder than the outer one. We've filled that space with endless noise, convinced that boredom is the enemy. But boredom, I realized, is just the beginning of creativity. It's the point where your mind stops consuming and starts producing. It's uncomfortable because it forces you to meet yourself, and sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. By evening, I took a walk with no destination. My thoughts wandered freely, unfiltered by the constant input of information. I noticed how ideas came and went like waves, some random, some profound. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was alive, filled with potential. It was as if the world had given me back something I didn't even know I had lost, my inner voice. That night, before bed, I didn't write a post or check a screen. I just sat in the quiet, watching shadows move across the ceiling, and felt something rare, contentment without distraction. It wasn't excitement or stimulation or validation. It was simply being. And maybe that's what we've forgotten how to do, to exist without an audience, without constant input, without the need to share everything. In the empty space of my mind, I found something I hadn't felt in a very long time myself. By the 6th day, boredom became my closest companion. It sat beside me at breakfast, lingered in the quiet hours between chores, and followed me into the afternoon like a faint shadow I couldn't shake off. In the beginning, it was unbearable. The kind of boredom that feels itchy, heavy, like time itself is pressing down on your chest. I paced the house, started tasks I didn't finish, stared at walls as if expecting them to entertain me. My brain screamed for stimulation, for something to feed on. But nothing came. The world had slowed to a crawl, and I was trapped inside it. For years, I had believed boredom was something to escape. I'd been conditioned to fill every gap, every moment of stillness, with something, a scroll, a swipe, a sound, a story. Silence had become a void I ran from. But now, with no phone to reach for, I had no choice but to sit with it. It was uncomfortable at first, like facing a version of myself I didn't fully know. But slowly, something began to shift. Beneath the irritation, there was space. Beneath the restlessness, there was stillness. I began to see that boredom wasn't empty, it was waiting. I remembered something I once read, that boredom is the mind's way of asking for meaning. It's a signal, not a failure. When we strip away constant stimulation, the brain starts searching inward, looking for patterns, stories, creation. In that way, boredom isn't a lack of activity, it's the birthplace of imagination. Every great idea, every invention, every moment of insight has come from someone who allowed themselves to sit in that quiet gap, long enough for something new to appear. And for the first time, I understood that. I began to lean into it. Instead of fighting the stillness, I started exploring it. I went for walks without music, without podcasts, just the sound of my steps and the rhythm of my breath. At first, my mind resisted. It wandered, complained, replayed random thoughts. But as the minutes turned into hours, that resistance softened. I began noticing small things, the texture of bark on trees, the way wind changes direction, how sunlight flickers differently on each surface. My senses, once dulled by constant digital brightness, were coming back to life. In boredom, I found a kind of mindfulness that had always been missing. When you're constantly entertained, your attention is always being pulled outward. But when there's nothing left to distract you, your focus turns inward, to your own thoughts, feelings, and surroundings. It's uncomfortable because it's honest. You can't scroll past yourself. You have to listen, to observe, to be. And somewhere in that observation, peace begins to grow. By afternoon, boredom had transformed into something else, curiosity. I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. Rearranging bookshelves. Sketching random patterns. Writing words that had no purpose other than to exist. None of it was impressive, but all of it felt real. I wasn't chasing results or likes or validation. I was simply engaging with the moment for its own sake. There was something deeply human about that, doing not for attention but for presence. I realized that the world before smartphones had always been filled with boredom. Waiting in lines, sitting on buses, watching rain hit windows. Those spaces were where daydreams were born, where thoughts connected, where imagination quietly thrived. Now we fill every pause with glowing distraction. We've lost the art of waiting, of wondering, of letting our minds wander freely. And without that wandering, creativity suffocates. We don't get bored anymore, we get exhausted. As evening arrived, I sat outside and watched the sky darken. There was nothing extraordinary about it. No fireworks, no perfect sunset, just the slow fading of light. But it was enough. For the first time in years, I didn't need my phone to capture the moment. I didn't need to share it or prove that I had seen it. The experience itself was complete, unrecorded, untouched. That night, I thought about how often we mistake boredom for emptiness when in truth, it's space, the space to think, to create, to feel, to be. Without that space, life becomes a blur of input and reaction. With it, life expands. And I realized that maybe we don't fear boredom because it's dull. Maybe we fear it because it forces us to be fully alive. To be alone with our thoughts. To see what's left when everything else is gone. When I woke up the next morning, the first morning after my 24 hours without my phone, the silence felt familiar instead of foreign. There was no urge to reach for something. No buzzing reminder of a world waiting to pull me back into its current. I sat there for a while, just breathing, realizing how light my mind felt, as if it had unclenched after years of gripping too tightly. The experiment was supposed to last only a day, but in that quiet moment, I understood something profound. I didn't want to go back, not entirely. Something had changed. Something deep. I had started this journey thinking it would just be a challenge, a small act of discipline to test how dependent I'd become. But what I discovered was far more intimate. Living without my phone for a day wasn't about losing convenience. It was about rediscovering connection. Not the digital kind, but the human, internal, and environmental kind. I had learned to see again. Not through a camera lens, not through someone's filtered highlight reel, but with my own eyes, raw and present. Without constant notifications, time felt slower but richer. Meals didn't blur into multitasking sessions. Conversations weren't half-finished because of a ping. Walking wasn't a means to reach somewhere, but an act of being somewhere. I noticed how the world carried a rhythm that technology had silenced. The sound of footsteps on gravel, the hum of distant traffic, birds calling to one another at dawn. These were sounds that had always been there, but I'd stopped hearing them, as if my phone had been playing a louder song in my head all along. The biggest lesson came in waves throughout the day, the realization that silence is not emptiness. For years, I had been terrified of it, equating quiet with loneliness. But silence, I learned, is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of awareness. In that awareness, I found peace. Thoughts that had been buried under endless scrolling began to rise. Memories I hadn't revisited in years returned with warmth. There were feelings I had ignored, questions I had postponed, dreams I had muted. And in that stillness, they began speaking again. I also learned something about attention, that it's the most valuable thing we own. Every swipe, every scroll, every notification is a small trade, a fragment of our focus, our presence, our life energy exchanged for digital noise. I had always told myself I was multitasking, staying informed, keeping up. But what I was really doing was scattering myself so thin that nothing truly stayed. Without my phone, I saw what undivided attention felt like, and it was powerful. Reading a single page without distraction felt more fulfilling than an hour of switching between apps. Watching clouds drift for 10 minutes felt more alive than 100 looping videos. Focus, I realized, is not about productivity, it's about presence. Another thing that struck me was how differently I experienced connection. Without messaging apps or social media, I reached out to people more intentionally. I called my friend using the old landline. I sat with my family and talked, really talked, not while half-reading notifications. I made eye contact more often. I laughed more fully. There was something pure about being unreachable for a while. Not invisible, but undemanded. I wasn't performing life for an audience. I was living it for myself. Of course, I knew I couldn't abandon my phone forever. It was too deeply tied to modern life, work, safety, contact. But the day had shown me that the device wasn't the problem. The imbalance was. Technology, I realized, is supposed to serve us, not shape us. The difference lies in who's holding the power. That one day without my phone was like pressing a reset button, not just on my habits, but on my perspective. When I finally turned my phone back on, the screen lit up with a flood of messages, missed calls, updates, reminders. For a second, the old reflex kicked in, that rush of dopamine, that pulse of connection. But this time I paused. I didn't open everything. I didn't feel the same pull. The notifications could wait. For once, I wasn't chasing the world. I was catching up with myself. As the day ended, I wrote a single line in my notebook, something I'd carry with me long after the experiment was over. The world doesn't disappear when you put your phone down. It starts appearing. And that was the real lesson. Without the constant noise, I found presence. Without the endless scrolling, I found stillness. And without my phone, I found myself, quieter, slower, more alive.